Our keynote speaker today, I think, is actually fantastically placed. In the first week of the seminar, we spoke about future climate projections. What's going to happen in the future, the difference of A1, A2, B1, B2 scenarios, and all the stuff that's kind of in the IPCC about what's going to happen in the future. Last week, we spoke about what climate was like in the past, how we know what climate was like 5,000 years ago, even though there wasn't a thermometer 5,000 years ago. Dr. Small was talking about that stuff. Today, Dr. Gabriela Ibarguchi will talk to us about the ecologies of our world and how the ecology is changing in response to climate change. So we're now kind of coming away from a mathematical world and coming into a more environmental, more ecological approach. Gabriela works on the ecology, evolution, and conservation of biodiversity in harsh environments. She has conducted research in polar, desert, marine, and high-altitude ecosystems throughout the Americas since the mid-1990s. I apologize. I was just making sure everyone's awake. Currently, Gabby teaches courses in conservation and environmental studies in the Department of Biology and in the School of Environmental Studies at Queen's University. She's also a research associate in biology and works on the diversification and conservation of water birds. Gabby is also a member of the International Arctic Terrestrial Biodiversity Steering Group, working to implement a master long-term monitoring plan across the circumpolar Arctic, in collaboration with the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, the biodiversity arm of the Arctic Council. She is also serving as a board member and mentor in IPEX, the Association of Polar Early Career Researchers. Today's talk, titled Shorelines, Treelines, Grasslands, and Iceworlds, Wildlife in a Shifting Climate. Thank you guys so much for coming. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Dr. Gabriela Ibarguchi.
All right, and because we have climate change, the computer fell asleep, you see. So just bear with me here. And break it up. All right, so again, thank you everyone for putting your celebrations aside for a beer later on and for being here. And I hope to share a bit of what's happening around the world, just outside, not just in Canada and the Arctic, but also in other parts of the world. So I know I gave my talk a very long title, but I do hope to take you to some of these places just to help you see what's happening elsewhere. And the picture you're looking at right now was taken at over 4,500 meters above sea level. And these are one of 3 species of flamingo that sometimes coexist. This is in the high Andes. And what you can see here is this very sort of browny, yucky stuff. This is actually the Atacama Desert. And in some places of the Atacama Desert, for as long as we've been keeping record, no rain has ever been recorded. So the water you see here, which is sometimes a bit salty, comes from sometimes deep within basically stores in the earth. And it does make us wonder what would happen if we have climate change in these places where some of the species just barely survive. But we don't want to get too sad. There are very cool species to be found, including new species of leprechauns, I'm sure. So I invite you to take a stroll with me. So these are basically some of the environments we'll be looking at. And by tree lines, I mean alpine environments. Iceworlds, I know that's a terrible word, like it's just cold areas, usually polar environments, but it could be other areas of the world. Shorelines, so anywhere where we have coastlines and also what's happening in the ocean. And grasslands, including some of our, definitely grasslands, but also our desert environments, which we have many around the world. And while I will be talking a little bit about my own research today, what I wanted to share with you is the picture that has emerged from the research I've done throughout the Americas and also from collaborating with people everywhere. My meetings that I just had some meetings in Iceland, meeting with CAF members of the Arctic Council. And there are a number of 22 biologists, and it was such a privilege. And I can't tell you the stories I was hearing from Siberia and the Yukon because of climate change. So as we had this crazy winter, they have flowers. They had the earliest flowers ever in Siberia. So anyway, so I hope to share some of these stories with you. And there's me in the Arctic, and I'm measuring seabirds. which have become really great indicators for the state of our ecosystems because they oftentimes feed on fish, and the fish need to have good, obviously, conditions in order to survive and reproduce. And here I am at the other end of the world. This is in a place called Torres del Paine, which is in southern Chile, in the Andes. And I'm actually studying a shorebird species. It's actually a nest that I'm measuring of the little eggs. This is a species that we know very little about. And while I've been doing some of this work, again, there's so many species that we don't know anything about, including plants and invertebrates. So I will be talking a little bit about my research, but mostly about a lot of the stories, also what I've seen. And this is basically what I'll be talking about. So we've heard a lot about climate change, and I think that's provided a really nice backdrop because now I think there's potentially some explanation of the climate issues, the physics, and all of these other things that I'm not an expert in. But I do want to share with you sort of what this means for species. And this may seem a little bit out of place, and is the issue of islands. But it'll become clear, hopefully, by the end of this presentation, why I think of the problems of climate change in a way as problems of islands. Okay? So I'll introduce you a little bit to island biogeography. And hopefully, by the end, I will convince you that climate change effects have a lot of similarity with the problems of islands. And then I will take you to some case studies, and I'll show you some of these environments that we've been talking about. So I think many of us are now quite comfortable with this definition of climate change, and this is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And essentially, this is generally the definition. So it's defined as statistically significant variation in the average state of climate or its natural variability, and is persisting for an extended period of time, decades or longer. So this means that we accept that there's some natural variation in ecosystems, in nature, but that there's kind of an average. And so climate change might be seen as a statistically significant deviation from that sort of natural variation. That's maybe when we have to worry. And if this is short-lived, like a couple of years, maybe we don't have to worry about it. But when we get into the decades, then we do have to start worrying about it. And I think it's generally accepted that there are some natural causes to climate change. Certainly climate change is not new on the planet, but what's maybe different is the fact that in such a short time frames as we really start, especially since industrial age, how the world is changing. So I think we accept that there are natural processes that can make climate change worse for us, but also that we are basically the major culprits in the modern sort of era of climate change. And this is due because we are altering the atmosphere, but as well as how we use land. So I think everyone understands that climate change has many, many complex effects. But I think when you start thinking about wildlife, we really have to kind of take it apart and kind of think about them a little bit further. So climate change really is not just global warming. So I think we've gotten very good over the last few years to stop using the word global warming, because it's not just global warming. And while many of you have been seeing these maps, I'm just going to briefly just describe it. Certainly, we expect that a lot of parts of the world may get warmer. Certainly, and on average, will get warmer. But this is very complex, because if you look at this map, the redder areas are potentially going to be hotter than other areas. So the increase in temperature is going to be more drastic, if you wish. Not that they're going to be hotter overall, but just the change between now and later on is going to be bigger. And of course, the big red areas are, as we have seen, are usually in the northern hemisphere, the Arctic. So do we have to be concerned about that? Yes, because these areas actually correspond to changes between 6 to 12 degrees. So when you hear an average of 0.6 degrees Celsius, that's like taking this and putting it into a blender, and that's your average temperature. But when you look at the local ecosystems, those changes could be actually a lot more drastic than 0.6 degrees Celsius. So the effects are quite complex. Some places can get colder. So again, think about species. I know many of you know this, but in case you have never thought about it, you have to look at the oceans. And in this case, this is a map of just a diagram of some of the major currents around the world. And there's one very important current called the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. And it goes around and around and around Antarctica. Now, that current is very critical because by volume, it's probably the biggest and stronger current we have in the world. And the ACC current, what it does is basically drives circulation around the world's basins. And it has branches that go into all the ocean basins. And in the Atlantic, we have a branch that goes up, and as things get basically closer to the equator, water can start warming up, and depending on the temperature of that water and its density, it can be at the surface of the ocean or deep underneath. But there's a certain branch here that then basically goes towards Europe, goes north, and this is the Gulf Stream. And the Gulf Stream and the cold water currents kind of do this thing, and they're sort of like sinking, and then they kind of go up because they're warmer, and they sink. A lot of people refer to this as the conveyor belt. And it's right here because it's warmer. Europe is a lot warmer than it should be, based on its latitude. And a lot of that sort of heat is due to the circulation in the oceans, which is warm water that comes basically off the equator and it goes up the Atlantic. We know from previous records, people have studied this in the past, so now we're talking about geological times, but people know that this has eventually shut down. And could this happen in the future? Absolutely. And so I think people are beginning to accept that this is definitely a scenario. And if that happens, some people estimate that Europe could get about 10 degrees colder. Not warmer, colder. And it's about, on average, the planet may get warmer, but again, depends where you are. So complex effects. What about precipitation? Again, I think a lot of people talk about drought. A lot of people talk about extra rain. And it depends where you are. The redder and purple areas on this map, again, just very quickly, this is one example of many potential simulations or modeling maps. But those darker areas in reds and purples would get drier. And these purples in light greens and light blues would actually get wetter. And this is not necessarily just rain. It could mean snow. And the winter that we just had gives you a reminder of what maybe our winters used to be like, because we seem to have forgotten that used to be a lot colder where we are. But don't forget that. That's ice and snow that can stay there, and it just can, pile up if it keeps snowing. And let's not forget storms. Storms feed because there's warm water in the ocean, and that's where they get basically their energy supply. And the warmer the surface water is, the more storms we have. And if you don't believe this, you can go back and start looking at records and the frequency of the storms. And I know the media sometimes play a role in sort of, great story, a big storm. But actually, when you look at the categories of the storms, those are big storms. When people say megastorm, they mean megastorm. And these are some examples of megastorms. Hayden, last year in the Philippines, was brutal. Sandy, Katrina, Larry in Australia. These were all like category 5. These are big storms. And they're becoming more frequent. So bigger storms, more frequent. And again, keep thinking about wildlife in the background because I will get to this. Sea level changes. This map basically, with the red areas, these areas are the areas that are at risk because they're kind of low-lying areas. They're at sea level or even below. So if we do have a sea level rise, these areas are the ones most at risk. And you can look at all this map, and pretty much every continent would be affected. And for us, here the Hudson Bay, etc., here Louisiana, Florida, in South America. And this doesn't just mean higher water. This is salt water. This is salt water that comes inland. And all these ecosystems that haven't seen salt water probably for maybe even millions of years or thousands of years suddenly get salt. And when you put salt water onto freshwater environments or land that hasn't seen salt, it can take a very long time to recover. And some members here in the audience are actually part of the Pearl Lab here at Queen's University. And there's at least one of their papers that talks about salt intrusion in the Arctic. And I believe after 2 decades, there's still damage in places where there was flooding. So you add storms, winds, waves, plus sea level rise, and you can have some very serious consequences for people and ecosystems. So this is not just high water, it's also salt and erosion. And here's a picture of what potentially, I know many people like to go to Florida for the winter, or Cuba, Louisiana. These are potential areas that could be lost. These are areas that are between 1 and 6 meters in terms of sort of being at risk. So if we predict that we might get sea level rise of half a meter to a meter, a lot of these areas will actually begin to disappear by 2100, by the year 2100. So this is within our lifetimes. Ecological changes. So now you can start thinking about ecological changes. And this is a really bad cartoon of a swarm of locusts. But we're seeing it. We're definitely seeing this. This is a paper published in Nature in 2009. And the title is Global Warming May Worsen Locust Swarms. So people are already beginning to see both an increase in the frequency of things such as pest outbreaks, as well as how big they are or how bad they are, because a lot of insects actually thrive in warmer climate. When you think about species, they tend to have a general distribution. If you alter the climate, that distribution may change over time. And what happens is sometimes species have co-evolved with each other. So, pollinators with their plants, et cetera, you have these interactions that have formed over potentially millions of years. So if the distribution of one part of that equation changes, the other one kind of needs to catch up or go extinct. So this is basically this cartoon. So here are your bees, your pollinators, and your plants, and they have a fantastic relationship because without the pollinators, a lot of plants wouldn't be able to produce seed, and a lot of things would starve. Here, there's a mismatch in terms of the timing. So these poor, the pollinators maybe emerge where they've kind of missed the peak blooming period, and that's your mismatch. And this is happening already. So here's a study from the high Arctic. This was studying shorebirds. And shorebirds have to time it perfectly. A lot of them feed on invertebrates. They breed in the Arctic. They fly very long distances to get there. And when they get there, they basically start producing eggs. They lay their eggs. The eggs hatch. And there's about a 2-week window for a lot of insects that emerge and are the primary food source for chicks. So everything's perfectly timed. And if because of climate change, that timing begins to change, there's a mismatch. So here's one species of shorebird, and that's exactly what people are beginning to see. So in some years where the chicks hatch exactly when the peak of that insect abundance happens, the chicks are doing very well, they gain mass, and they're doing very well. Years where that's a bit asynchronous, they kind of stop growing. There's not enough food, they've missed it. They missed that peak. So we're beginning to see these mismatches. Now I don't have to explain anthropogenic disturbance, but actually climate change makes it easier for us as humans to make more climate change. And I think this is easy to understand if you think about access. So even just for us, the Arctic, we talk about access to the Arctic resources, the melting of sea ice, shipping, the Northwest Passage. Well, the more that opens, that means that we can go in, potentially, places where there used to be ice. And that will happen in Antarctica too, by the way. So, we've got all this extra potential sources of resources that we haven't even yet exploited, and once that happens, all of those gases, greenhouse gases can go into the atmosphere. So this is just a cycle. Repeat itself. So that's a lot to take in, but I'm going to try to summarize it. So we have climate change, we have the anthropogenic effects, such as development and transport, which means that we can potentially put in more contaminants into the environment. We can bring in more non-native species. So as we're shipping and things get into our containers, they get into our ships, and they end up where they shouldn't be, in a different continent. They might get established. We're obviously altering land, the land that we're using, putting in more roads. We have more development, more resource extraction. We have more tourism, more people moving around, and potentially bringing more non-native species. And again, the more we do this, especially with access to resources that right now are kind of not accessible for us, we can create more climate change. So that's actually a two-way street. Climate change and climate effects. So weather, hydrology, erosion, this is what I was talking about. So let's not forget that we can have more severe storms, more flooding, sea level rise, soil intrusion, erosion, weather changes, habitat change. Think about snow and ice. If plants are used to having snow cover for 8 months of the year because they're really far north, what will happen is suddenly they don't have a lot of ice. Chances are they could dry out, could get drier. So all of these things are important. And of course we have our ecological effects. So now I just talked about mismatches and distribution changes. So you have unpredictability. Things don't know when they're supposed to be breeding. They don't know where the food supply is going to be or where the next watering hole is going to be available. So there are mismatches in new conditions. That could be genetically or physiologically. Just the hormones are out of whack because they're used to doing something for thousands or millions of years. So it's going to take a while for things to kind of catch up. Non-native species. Non-native species could be new competitors, new bacteria, new viruses, new predators. All of this can happen. And of course that can mess up the breeding success of things. So all of these are effects of climate change in one way or another. A very important one too that I don't want to forget to mention is that if you think about when you have corridors, so if you have a migratory species, say you have caribou or you have birds or whatever, and they're sort of used to having a migratory route. If you have climate change and suddenly, you have sea ice that melts, or you have, maybe drought, and suddenly your forest becomes kind of two fragments with grassland between, maybe that small animals no longer want to cross that dry barrier. So that could also affect connectivity in our landscape. So these are the effects, and just in boxes, just what we just talked about. That's exactly what we were just talking about. But just to remind you, in terms of complex effect, all of these actually impact habitat. So habitat's really important. But so this is not just the land area, the physical space that species are using. You have to think about the quality. Like, is there any food there anyway, right? So the quality of it, definitely the total area, how connected it is. So again, if you're a migratory species, or if there's a fire, can species kind of just move a little bit out of the way and find suitable habitat, or are they stuck? Population sizes. So once you start shrinking the habitat, you're going to have to worry about how small those population sizes get. And this is basically a whole topic for a different topic. But you can get into issues of genetics and many other things, and demographic issues. So this is actually a very important thing to consider when you think about habitat and how small it can get. There's this quote that I think it's very meaningful, and it says, "Without habitat, there's no wildlife." It's that simple. It's from Wildlife Habitat Canada. And if you think about it, no matter how many conservation programs you have and captive breeding and so on, if you then release your species, if there's no habitat, there's no chance in heck they can make it. And so I want to modify this too, because again, it's not just a space, is it suitable? Are those resources still there? Is it still well connected? These are really, really critical things to think about. And there's this really funny cartoon I used in one of my lectures, and it's very sad and funny at the same time. I don't know, it's very sad and funny, maybe suitable for today. But here you have two polar bears, and they're swimming, and they're angry bears. And their sky's all polluted, and one of them says, "Fossil fuels, global warming, rising sea levels, what's next?" Right, for the polar bears. So then one of them gets into this little habitat island here of ice, and says acid levels, and its legs are dissolving. Okay, so this is really sad, but it is a cartoon. But this is actually true. This is climate change, and I'm going to show you how even acid levels in the ocean can be changed by climate change. Okay, so back to our little sort of ecosystems. It turns out that you can break up how the world is if you think about it as a world of islands. And I think that's what makes sense when you're trying to figure out the problems that you're dealing with, right? You have to dissect the problem. So if you think about it, a lot of our habitats are actually islands. So here's some natural occurring islands. And so if you're a very small species, a microbe or an invertebrate, even vegetation patches on a beach or a desert can be islands. If you're in Antarctica, you're a microbe, you live in cryoconite holes, and these are entire ecosystems. You can have nunataks over ice. You can be in the savanna and be like gentle invertebrates, and the trees can be islands. And of course, you have archipelagos around the world. And then you have your modern day habitat islands, and this is what we refer to as habitat fragmentation. And here's a picture of Kingston, and you can clearly see, well, maybe not, it's not such a good picture, but you can actually see the patches, the island patches, different crops, urban, rural, some forests, and it's kind of fragmented. So we have islands. You go to a rural environment, same thing. So here's some clear cuts in the West Coast. Here's Mexico City, where I grew up. Here's the city. We actually have quite a bit of wildlife. Very cool hummingbirds in some of these places. You're right, here are some islands. Here are your highways, right? So think about things that have to disperse across the barriers from one island to the other. So the problem is that while your natural islands have been around for a long time, potentially, basically through evolution, species have been able to adapt, potentially over millions of years, to these habitats. They're very good at it now, right? They've adapted to these habitats. Well, when you create this sort of human islands that we've created, this may go back just a few years, a few months, all the way to only a few thousand years, really, because we haven't really had a very big human population probably since the Pleistocene. So this is only going back to a few thousand years at the most. And so that's not enough time for species to adapt. I mean, some of them have managed to tolerate us, and they're kind of coping, but most of them aren't. And if you think about it, imagine you're a species that lives over here, and now you have to jump all the way over here. Right? This is a mountain. This is pretty big. So imagine your two little cartoon frogs here. The more you start taking away of the middle connecting environment, and you end up with these two islands that are very separate from each other, not only can things not get back and forth to interbreed, they start becoming adapted to their own local conditions. And if those things are really far apart, it's like, little frogs speaking Spanish saying hola, and this one's like, what? What'd you say? This could be thousands of kilometers. This is not good for species. They need to kind of keep going and interbreed in order to remain healthy, unless they have evolved in island ecosystems. So that's the important point, that if we lose the connectivity, this is a very serious problem. And this kind of leads us to island biogeography. So the island of Krakatoa, 1883, this volcanic island, this volcano erupted in a devastating sort of way. And it modified not only that island that basically only left a fragment, but all the islands around. This is basically, here's Indonesia, and Krakatoa Island would have been there, and now it's just a little piece. What was cool about this thing, and so again, there's always a silver lining, people began to get interested in how species recolonized this devastated land. What happened? And this gave birth to what we call island biogeography. And MacArthur and Wilson in 1967 published a really great piece of work called Equilibrium Theory of Island Biogeography. I won't give you too many details, but there are two very important ideas that I will explain briefly. But the main idea was that they were trying to predict the number of species that you could expect on an island to see if there was a pattern. And for sure, they found a pattern. And it's been kind of confirmed ever since. There's some exceptions, but the pattern holds. And so let me just share with you two of these very important things, because this will help you understand climate change and the effects on wildlife. So the first is the species-area relationship. And the main message is very, very easy. Larger areas generally support more species. Very easy. And the size effect is actually stronger for islands than a mainland, okay? So here's a little graph. So picture that you have area here, a bigger area is here, and here are your species. And the higher you go up on this axis, you have more species. And your mainland, here's your slope for mainland. So you have more species, generally speaking, on mainlands than islands. But the larger your area gets, you have kind of this very, quickly rising slope here for islands. So it's a very important effect that the more land you have on an island, the more species you may be able to support. In general, what happens too is that the larger areas generally have a bit more habitat. So if you have a few lakes and you have a bit of grassland and a bit of forest, if you have a lot of variety of habitats, you're going to have more species potentially just because those habitats are different. And if you think even about of an island of equivalent size, if you go to a place such as Hawaii that has volcanoes and it has all kinds of habitats, it's very, there's a lot of diversity there. It's not a huge island, but compared to an island of similar size, it has more species because of this. Okay, so that's the number one thing about island biogeography. And if you look at a map, this is the exact same idea. I just want to show it to you on a map. This is a map of plant diversity. And the darker green areas basically represent more species. So if you're on the mainland, say in Asia, and you start going out towards Japan, you can sort of see, first of all, that you don't have as many species, right? So this is really dark green, this is a little lighter. And you start getting to the smaller islands, and you start basically getting lower and lower diversity. And of course, there's an effect because you start going up in latitude as well. But once you get into these very small islands, you just don't see any very dark green ones. Like, it's hard to see a very dark green island here. Usually they're less diverse. And then that takes us to the next step of island biogeography, and this is isolation effect. Okay? So more isolated islands generally have fewer species. The more distant an island is from a source population, such as a mainland, then the fewer species it's going to have. So this distance effect has to do with, if you picture a butterfly, imagine a little vagrant butterfly gets lost and it goes over water. It's going out over the ocean. If the island is really close, it might just by chance find it, land there, and be fine. If the island is very far, it's probably going to drown before it gets there. And that's what happens. So you have a distance effect, and so if things are really far, just things are not able to colonize it, so you have less species. But you also have this extinction effect on island. Extinction is a fact of life. So if you don't have kind of a steady supply of newcomers that help keep the population up in those isolated islands, eventually it could become extinct. Okay, so the population on these distant islands could become extinct if they're too far away from the source of new, to fortify the troops, if you wish. And you can definitely see this on this map as well. If you head out towards Russia to the Kuril Islands, a lot of these islands are just so, they're very light green, meaning they have very low diversity because they're so distant from mainlands. Now I know that's a bit of theory, and that's all the theory I wanted to give you today, but if you understand this, when you think about climate change, you'll think about it differently, and I promise you that, because I think if we think about the island effect, this helps us understand what's happening to wildlife. You have other issues too. If we think about climate change, we have random events. So imagine a storm or an outbreak. That could actually decimate a small population on an island anyway. You can also get into genetic effects such as inbreeding because the population is gotten so small. Okay, so it's very, very complex. I just wanted to keep it very simple and just think about, again, islands and isolation and losing connectivity and having smaller land area. Now we can apply to the case studies, and I think they'll make a little bit more sense. So if you start fragmenting habitat, or because of climate we lose, if you had a nice water body here in the desert and you now only have a little puddle, what's going to happen, right? And you can think about iceworlds. So if you have the loss of sea ice, et cetera, what would happen? So let's start with the polar environments that we're kind of used to. So I took this picture actually flying over Canada, and this is on the East Coast. And actually these are islands just off the East Coast. And what you see is a healthy dose of sea ice. Now, I was obviously up in a plane, but if I could walk down and see this, I'm sure there'll be tracks all over the snow. A lot of things will be able to go back and forth from one island to the other, just walking on the sea ice. Tony Gaston and colleagues at Environment Canada recently published this really interesting study, and it's all island biogeography. So it was titled Ice Bridging as a Dispersal Mechanism for Arctic Terrestrial Vertebrates and the Possible Consequences of Reduced Sea Ice Cover. This is the same picture I just showed you. They just took a map and they just plotted the islands around the Arctic. So here's Canada, here's Greenland, this is the Arctic Ocean, here's the Atlantic would be here. And then you go around, and this is now Siberia, like Russia, Finland, etc. Okay, so this is the circumpolar Arctic. So they basically just plotted the diversity of vertebrates on these islands. So what you see here, this is all you have to worry about, is the really big colorful dots. The really big colorful dots mean there are a lot of species, and these tiny dots you can't even see, little yellow ones and so on, like right there. These are very low diversity islands, okay? And the pattern that emerges is, just like island biogeography, bigger pieces of land have more diversity. But also, how close they are to source populations, i.e. the mainland, or to each other. And also, it's going to depend on where the sea ice is. So where things can get back and forth, no problem. You got lots of diversity. Where things are kind of out in the middle of nowhere, including Iceland, kind of hard to get there. So you're kind of stuck with what's there, what can potentially make it there eventually. So that was fine. That was the first step. But when they took that, they wanted to figure out, what happens if you were to lose sea ice. So forget swimming, because, for example, caribous and polar bears are excellent swimmers. But what happens if you can't swim? What's going to happen? How far can animals disperse over land or over ice just by walking? And so they plotted that on a graph, and you got kilometers here. So that's the distance that animals can normally disperse back and forth walking on ice or on land. And they plotted a number of species. And some things like the grizzly bear are great at dispersing, 100 kilometers, no problem. Then you've got things like lemmings. And lemmings are these little small mammals, and they are the staple food for a lot of Arctic carnivores, wolves, foxes, birds of prey, owls, etc. Very, very important. And these little guys, poor little things, they can't even make it to 50 kilometers. They'll be lucky to make it to like about 10 kilometers, right? So if you lose sea ice, then these particular small mammals are not going to be able to disperse. Once they're stuck on their island, it's a bit of a ticking bomb. Because if things are fantastic and great, they'll just live on the island. But if there's an outbreak or a storm or something happens, there are going to be very few colonizers that can colonize that island again, because nobody can get there unless you were to transport them by air or ship. So this is a problem, because if you lose sea ice, then you can't have as much dispersal. You're going to have higher species loss. And again, these things are the food staple of the Arctic. If you lose them, you're going to lose the predators. So you can very quickly see how things can become extinct on islands, in some of our islands. So that was actually very eye-opening. Here's another kind of disturbing picture. This has to do with ecological interactions. These are thick-billed murres, and these are Arctic seabirds, and they dive for fish, and then in the summer, they come to land to lay a single egg that hatches out, and then they go back out to sea. Okay? So these adults are incubating a single egg or brooding a single chick. That's it. They have kind of one shot. And what we're beginning to see in some places we study is that polar bears are becoming a big predator, which is not very common because, as you can see, this is not easy for a polar bear to climb. But they are so hungry because the sea ice is gone. So they are not able to hunt on sea ice the seals they normally would hunt. So they come onto land because they've been swimming and there's no aid, and they're not able to hunt. So they're feeding another prey. That's actually not ideal for them either. Doesn't have enough fat, doesn't have enough calories, there's not enough of them. But this is the kind of ecological interactions that we're beginning to see that are changing. Here's another one. So I actually work with Tony Gaston and colleagues, and I have participated in a lot of the sort of the diet studies. And basically, so here I think the murres again, and what this bird has in its mouth is called Arctic cod, and I just actually pictured from online. And these fish are actually kind of fatty, kind of delicious. And then there are other species such as capelin. Now this poor fish was kind of in the bill of a bird, so it's kind of squished. But they're actually very kind of skinny, long fish compared to Arctic cod. So before the mid-1990s, you would see that in the diet of what the parents were bringing back to the colony, you had a very high proportion of Arctic cod. That's the line in yellow. And basically, these are the years. And right about the 1990s, you start to see a decline in Arctic cod and an increase in capelin. And that was because the prey species in those same waters at that same colony were changing. And so basically, what the birds are bringing back now is capelin. Now, initially, kind of like the shorebirds and the invertebrates, the parents were not able to feed their chicks enough calories or enough of a good food source. So they were actually a bit underweight when they were leaving the colony. We don't know how well they survived. They did not seem to do as well. So they did really well on Arctic cod, not so good on capelin. The good news is I was talking to my collaborator, and it seems that the birds are somehow cluing in that they need to bring in more, lots more of this fish. So they're working a lot harder to try to make up that discrepancy. And we'll see how they do. They're very long-lived seabirds, so we don't know if they're going to live shorter lives because they're just burning out, flying out a lot more, bringing one fish at a time. But these are the kind of ecological effects that we're beginning to see, and these are quite real in my own lifetime of research. We hear about invasive species or non-native species, and for those of you not familiar with this, shipping is a huge problem because we do import a lot of non-native species into waters where they shouldn't be. And this is already on people's minds. People are writing about melting Arctic ice will make way for more ships and more species invasions. There's actually an example of a diatom that used to be in the Pacific, and for the first time ever, it was recorded in the Atlantic, and it shouldn't be there. So it actually apparently moved through a break in the sea ice. So this could happen, and of course we know about the Northwest Passage, but there are many other routes that are potentially being planned by other countries. And a lot of invasive species come in the ballast water, in the cargo. A lot of rats and mice have made it to islands because they're in the cargo. Snakes. I'm not saying they're going to survive in the Arctic, but you never know. And as the climate gets more moderate, less extreme, less cold, a lot of these things could become established. So this is something that's very worrisome for a lot of biologists. Okay, so I've been talking about the ocean quite a bit, but let's focus on some of the actual shorelines to see what some of the effects could be, or what the kinds of effects we're already seeing. So here's a beautiful turtle, a marine turtle. This is a lowerhead turtle. And the turtles will live at sea, and they'll come onto beaches to lay their eggs, and then the moms just leave. So this female is actually laying eggs, so she's kind of just finishing up and kind of covering up her eggs. And eventually, after the appropriate time, the little hatchlings will basically emerge and swim out to sea, which is always a very happy sight. I want to show you just an example of a study, and it was done in Cyprus. So I just wanted to show you where Cyprus is. This is the Mediterranean Ocean. Here's Turkey, and there's Cyprus. So loggerhead turtles actually nest in a lot of places around the world. If you go to Florida, you might see them. So they're pretty neat. They're pretty spectacular, actually. But here's something that a lot of people haven't thought about. So let me just start by saying that, for those of you who don't know this, for a lot of reptiles and amphibians, the sex of that individual is determined by temperature. Now, some fish, it can actually be reversible. So sometimes, depending on the temperature, they can reverse between being male and female. But I believe that in a lot of reptiles and amphibians, once they sort of hatch out that way, once they sort of turn into that sex, they kind of stay to be that sex, because there are also a lot of characteristics that they develop. So for species where they're temperature dependent for their sex determination, I don't think a lot of us have thought about climate change, but this is going to be a problem. This is an example. So this study was done in Cyprus, the island I just showed you. And just very quickly, little pies here, the black areas are the proportion of males, and the white areas are the proportion of females. And these are hatchling turtles. So this study looked at a whole bunch of different areas on Cyprus and was looking at the hatchling sex ratios. And they realized that we have a very big bias of females. Very big bias of females. Very few males to be found. And a lot of people say, well, the females can lay eggs, so that's the sex we need to worry about anyway. But not necessarily, because think about genetic diversity. If you have only 3 males siring a whole bunch of different, offspring, it's going to be, there's not a lot of genetic variation there. So that's actually still a very big problem. So this is something that we might need to worry about, right? Are we going to have fewer male turtles in a warmer world? I don't know. Maybe the turtles will figure out to nest in that area that's more covered by trees, so it doesn't get as hot. I don't know. But anyway, this is something that's on our minds now. This is a photo of a mangrove forest. I'm cheating. This is now in Mexico. But mangrove forests are very important shoreline environments around the world because I call them nurseries. A lot of species from the ocean and from land will come into places like mangrove forests to lay their eggs, to have their babies. And so a lot of very large predators can't get here as easily. Some of them can, of course, but they have babies too. So anyway, these are very productive environments, very important for reproduction. However, something that's a bit of an unusual creature in mangrove forests, tigers. Kind of unusual. In fact, quite unique in the world. There's actually only one population of mangrove forest tigers. And that's in Sundarbans, which is basically between Bangladesh and India. There's a little area of mangroves. And this population of tigers is unique in the world in the sense that they have evolved to basically exploit this habitat. So they're very good at it. And here's a study that talks about sea level rise and tigers, predicting the impacts on these particular tigers. Okay, so they have actually modeled sea rise. And the first thing we need to worry about is how many tigers do we have? Well, in Asia, tigers used to have very extensive range, but now they only occupy about 7% of what's left of their range. They had a very big historic range, but now only about 7% of that range is still full of tigers. And there's not that many tigers, probably about 4,000 or even less. So that's a big problem. And based on their modeling, they were basically looking at just a 28 centimeter rise. That's nothing, 28 centimeters rise. And what basically would happen is about 96% of that mangrove habitat could be underwater. And remember, on the shoreline, you may have higher water. And if you go inland, it could go on, it could go below sea level. So,
30 minutes. Thank you.
Does anyone have any overdue books? And again, sorry, this is kind of sobering, but if you calculate, you look at their numbers, they calculate only about 20 breeding adults could live in that area. And that's a 28 centimeter rise. Okay, and this is one example of one mangrove forest, and there are so many mangrove forests around the world. So it kind of gets you thinking about, oh my goodness, these are, can things move and get out of the way of the rising sea? Now, many of you have heard about corals. I won't talk about them a lot. I think many of you have heard about coral bleaching. So that's when corals turn white because they lose their symbionts, which are the ones that photosynthesize and help with nutrition for the coral. When the water's too warm or there are contaminants, the symbiont, the microbes basically go out of the coral or die, and then the corals starve, and that's why they go white. So coral bleaching is a big problem because of temperature. So places around the world, maybe some corals, some individual places are potentially beginning to adapt to warmer waters, but this is not across the world yet. So that might be kind of good news that there's some adaptation, but it might not be fast enough. We have coral pathogens that really love warm water, and they're doing really well, and so it's really bad for corals. We have invasive species such as algae and things that just do better in warm water that shouldn't be there. And then we have ocean acidification. So how does that happen? Very simply, this actually doesn't have to do with temperature. This is actually a carbon dioxide problem. Carbon dioxide itself is the problem. It goes into the water, which it does anyway. It does all the time. The ocean is always full of some carbon dioxide that dissociates. So this molecule goes into the water. The problem is the high quantities of carbon dioxide that we may have. So it's a molecule. It combines with water. Chemical bonds break up, etc. Things recombine. You get carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then basically releases hydrogen ions. There's your acid right here. And your acid also does kind of a bad thing because there are bicarbonate ions in the water, and the hydrogen ions combine with that. And that's a problem because things like corals and a lot of shelled organisms in the ocean have calcium carbonate skeletons or shells. So if you take away some of these components, what are they supposed to make their skeletons with? So they basically are lacking what they need to make their shells. And experimentally, this is a picture of something called pteropods, and pteropods are very important in marine marine food chains. Very, very important. And this is just one example of all the shelled organisms you can think of in the ocean, including corals. But basically, if you raise the pH level just a little bit, this is what happens to their shells. They become deformed, and they become very, very easy prey for predators. They don't stand a chance. There's nothing to protect them. So this is actually a very big problem for marine food webs. The Great Barrier Reef in Australia, it's in decline. Here's a study that looked at over 215 surveys of data since 1985 to 2012. That's nothing. They realized there's probably about a 50% loss of coral cover in this part of the world. And the main issues, the main mortality sources were definitely coral bleaching. That was about 10% of that huge mortality. Tropical cyclones were 48%. You know what that is? It's not that tropical cyclones are new in the Great Barrier Reef. It's just that they're happening at such big scale and so frequently that the corals, even though they're actually recovering, can't keep up. They can't keep up. So the frequency and the strength of these cyclones is what's taking out a lot of the coral. And there are many other issues as well, but I just wanted to mention that to you because let's not forget about the damage to people from storms, but also to wildlife. It's important. And unfortunately, they didn't have enough data to measure acidification, but they think that that's probably also a problem already. It's starting, but it's already potentially being felt around the world. Tree lines, we're actually almost done because this is actually a little bit brief. But for those of you who haven't thought about alpine areas are completely unique ecosystems. And there are species that have thrived in these ecosystems. You don't find them necessarily everywhere. And this is a picture of alpine ibex, actually a very cool sort of conservation comeback story, even though their genetic diversity is very low, they're actually recovering. They were almost extinct at one point, and this is in Italy. But anyway, I just want to show you this picture because when you look around, it doesn't look like any other part of the world. They're very unique ecosystems. There are a lot of plants and lichens and all kinds of mammals and birds that exclusively use these areas. So here's an example of kind of an endemic plant. This is actually now in Sweden. And I just wanted to throw up this slide very quickly to show you that people are also modeling the effects of climate change on tree lines. So how far does the forest go up? Meaning, if you have habitat islands at the tops of mountains, are they essentially, it's like sea level rise, but instead of sea, you have forest that's kind of rising, and eventually your island is going to be overcome with forest, and you're going to lose that habitat. So these researchers, what they did is they modeled, again, if you just look at a 0.6 degree rise in temperature versus 2.6 degrees to 4 degrees, by the year 2100, what would happen to tree lines, i.e., again, like a sea rise level, but it's forest. So that's 100-meter rise, or 400-meter rise in the tree lines. And this is a habitat that's kind of very specific, like alpine habitat. And one of them is alpine heath. There are many other types of habitats. But essentially, right now, this is essentially what you have in Sweden. And even with the modest 0.6 degrees Celsius in temperature, you can already see you've lost a lot of your red areas. And if you have a higher increase by 2100, you almost have complete loss of that habitat. And look at the little fragments. They'll eventually probably go extinct, these little islands. So this is why the world is full of islands. So we have to worry about island by geography. In Canada, the mountain pine beetle. This is actually a native species. And we have lived with outbreaks, and the forest have lived with these outbreaks for as long as the forests have been around. The problem is that we have climate change, and we have less extreme cold events. And those less extreme cold events are not happening as often as they used to, that would take back the populations down to a very small level, is making, basically those are gone. They're not happening frequent enough. So the beetles are just exploding in population sizes, and they're everywhere. And the more the milder our winters are, then they just keep spreading and spreading, even into colder areas. So if areas get warmer, they're just gonna keep spreading. And potentially people have seen them in Ontario boreal forests. This is very sobering, actually, very, very frightening. And this is almost the end of the talk here. I wanted to take you to South America. And that's because there's a lot of arid land in South America, a lot of examples of grasslands and deserts. And in particular, this is a picture of Patagonia. And why do we care about arid lands? They're actually really cool places for biodiversity. Very cool places. I think they're very misunderstood. Here's a picture of rheas, which are one of the most ancient bird groups in the world. And to many people see a desert and they see a wasteland, but when you actually get down on your hands and knees and kind of spend a couple of days, it's actually really exciting. So, why South America? Here are the Andes Mountains. They're very high. All this gray area is approximately about 3,400 meters up, so very high mountains. This is the Central Andes. This is basically where I took that picture from the Atacama Desert at the beginning of the talk with the flamingos. These places are dry. Anything that's red or brown is less than 250 millimeters of rain per year. Very dry. This is a map of endemic species. These are species that are unique to our region in the world. The redder the map, the redder the areas, the more species diversity. Funny enough, some of the highest diversity is in some of the bone-dried places in South America. Look at that. So it's actually pretty cool. Here's that same place I showed you at the beginning of the talk, the Atacama Desert, and the little puddle of water, and it was chock full of diversity. Species that people haven't even described yet. Here's Patagonia. And here's actually a fence. It's not a very good picture, but I like the fact that there was a fence here to show you. Patagonia is already becoming drier. There's desertification going on. And the biggest problem in South America right now is the introduction of sheep, because they are the major causes of this. So here you can see better vegetation than here, and this is just gets drier and more eroded and so on. So climate change plus sheep is a really bad recipe for Patagonia. And if you're in a place like this, where you're at the foothills of the Andes, this might be wet, but if you actually walk a little bit away from the snow line, it's actually really dry. But imagine climate change and the species that then have to start colonizing what? Walls? I mean, this is really not feasible for a lot of vertebrates. It is maybe for some plants and birds, but you've got to actually look at the topography, and it's not realistic for species to move around when we think they can. It's not necessarily realistic to move away to better suitable habitat. And again, we may be losing a lot of really cool diversity. This is again Patagonia, all these different species with all kinds of very cool adaptations. Here's a plant that actually is bird pollinated because there are just not that many pollinators around. So it has evolved a symbiosis with a bird, and the bird comes and eats this white part, and it gets pollen on its head. And it's a beautiful, happy relationship. Yeah. They're birds with weird mating systems. Here's an egg that was laid by a different female in the same nest of this female, and it's a very interesting mating system. I'll just leave it at that in case there are any young members of the audience. I photographed this random reptile one day. I was working there. I photographed tons of things. This is potentially a new species. My friend has another picture of another potential new species of Leolemos lizards, which are a species complex. We don't know a lot about them. People are describing them a lot everywhere, but there are still a lot of species that we don't know what they are. So I just wanted to show you this, the loss of what, the potential things that we can lose, because they're already on the edge. They're just hanging on. So what happens with climate change? So I just wanted to remind you that, we have these major issues. Poverty came up earlier in the conversation. So what are some things happening around the world? We may have water diversion projects. Definitely in South America, we have growing communities, more industry, more agriculture, more livestock, land conversion, resource extraction. Mining and oil are huge. In South America, like in the Arctic. Poverty. This is a big factor, okay? We really have to do something about this. Introduce species. So I just wanted to remind you that some of the places I showed you today, the harsh environments I often work on, they're very fragile. Like the species are hardy and they're tough, but they're very fragile ecosystems. They're already kind of at the extreme of life. If you push them further and you push them too quickly, I don't know if a lot of species will make it. So we do have to worry very much about climate change. Sorry, this is a picture to remind us that, land use. So even local people are beginning to have sheep instead of vicuñas and llamas, which are sort of most suited for that environment. And I hope I convinced you that climate change does affect everyone. We have islands everywhere, and it does affect all of us. Here's a cartoon that says, how climate change will affect man on a desert island cartoons. Blue, blue, blue. I don't know. Yes, that's going to be a problem. Policy. Here's another cartoon. They're already kind of drowning, sort of. I refer to line 1405, section 315, blah, 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 blah. Good. So we have agreed that CO2 levels will be down by 2160.
Oh, that's nice.
Fireworks. Yeah, go for it. Go for it. Climate change. It is St. Patty's Day. Anyway, thank you for going to festivities. I just want to say thank you for coming. And hey, can't greenhouse gases escape through the hole in the ozone layer?